All right. So we are continuing in our study of the Sabbath. And so I wasn't here last week, and so you guys will all have to fill me in on what that was all about, as if I hadn't watched it. But that's irrelevant because you weren't supposed to know that. So what did you discuss last week in Sunday school? The Old Testament Sabbath, good. Getting us out on the right foot. We're in the right Testament. And what did you see about Sabbath in the Old Testament and why it was instituted?
To take one day off. God supplied their needs with manna. They were not allowed to collect it for more than one day until Friday. They could collect some for the Sabbath, and then it wouldn't rot like the other days did. So it was, they should have seen the hand of God in that.
Right. Yeah, God's provision that on every other day when they tried to collect more than enough for the next day, it went bad. But on Friday, they collected enough for the 2 days, and it was still good for them to eat on Saturday on the Sabbath. And so that was all a part of God's plan of rest for them from the normal routines of their life. And there was obviously some pretty strict rules and regulations as to what that should look like, right? So what was, there were several verses that kind of just mentioned what could or couldn't be done on the Sabbath. Do you recall any of those? Right, couldn't do any work, not even the gathering of food, which is interesting in the light of our first text today in the New Testament. What else? Any other specifics that they gave? Yeah, couldn't travel much. Mary?
Handmaidens or their servants or their animals. Nobody could work.
Yeah, nobody. Yeah, pretty limited, right? Good. What else?
Far of things not to do, because I know Jesus said, if someone's sick, better take care of them.
Right.
Heal or,
He said, didn't he will take it too far? And I think that's exactly what we see in the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, which is today. Because in the Old Testament, I mean, we literally had those commands, not we. They had those commands. This is what you must do and not do on the Sabbath day. And yet when we come into the New Testament, particularly in the Gospels, we are given some almost things that seemed contradictory because Jesus is contradicting what the Pharisees say. Now, was what the Pharisees said, was that straight from the law or not? Oftentimes. What do you think? No? Why not?
Put more things to it. How many steps could you take? What could you do? What couldn't you do? They added more rules than what was actually there.
Right. Yep. Yeah, when you think of certain standards or policies or different things that are made nowadays, and you hear of the letter of the law and that, the Pharisees were the ones that were getting out the measuring tape. Is this long enough? Is this short enough? Whoa, what can we do here? Right? They were adding to it. A lot of it was just straight from their oral law and not even the law of the Old Testament. So today, as we look at the Gospels and what Jesus particularly said in the Gospels, really we're moving one step closer to understand what role, if any, the Sabbath plays in in relation today to us, to the church, and to worship today. But in the Gospels, it's a unique transitional period because Jesus was still under the law. Now, he does say in Matthew 5 that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And there's different understandings of what that even means, that he came to fulfill the law. But it is interesting that he says he didn't come to abolish it when it's clear from the epistles, which we'll look at next week, that wasn't the rules of the law were no longer binding on New Testament believers. But here in the Gospels, Jesus, his disciples, they are still following living under the law. but there's still a fierce resistance from those who don't see it the way that Jesus saw it, from those who added to what the Old Testament said. And so the main encounters that we see regarding the Sabbath in the Gospels are centered around situations of what I call Sabbath extremes. They resulted from the beliefs of the Pharisees, who weren't actually following the intent of the law, but were more concerned with their oral traditions regarding it. Right? Intent is important, because God, when he created the law, there was an intent behind it. What was the intent behind the Sabbath? Rest, worship, right? Those two pretty closely related, and yet very different. But how are the Pharisees twisting that original intent? What do you think?
Rules, you actually make it work.
Right, by adding more rules, you actually make it work, and they weren't any longer making it about the internal, but about the external, right? How did they look? How did they appear before others? And so it was no longer about the intent. And we see that as well today in different things. People talk about the letter of the law or the what?
Spirit.
Or the spirit of the law. Speeding, for some reason, is just always that one that comes to mind, right? Are you obeying the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? Sometimes it's unsafe to go what is actually the speed limit. And so that would break, in a sense, the spirit of the law, that don't drive faster than conditions should be for you. Scott?
Having a fire, was that a Pharisee thing, or was it actually in the Old Testament, not to have a fire on the Sabbath? This keeps coming back to me when we've been talking about this. There was a church that I went to across the street was a Jewish synagogue, and I was told that the pastor, the priest, rabbi, yeah, whatever, that was my next guess. The rabbi would drive only so far then walk, because you wouldn't have fire. Well, if you have ignition in an engine, there's fire. So that's all extreme.
Yeah, does anyone recall if you weren't allowed to build a fire on the Sabbath? I don't recall. I don't feel like they could gather firewood. But
Pharisaical.
yeah, but I think that, for the modern day, that points to the Pharisaical nature of it for nowadays, because you have modern day rabbis who drive modern day cars, and you maybe make the argument not to fill up your gas on Sabbath, right? But for them to say, well, that's starting a fire by just that little click of a switch, and so that would be wrong. That fire you could argue flipping the ignition is work, but that would be even more extreme. But to say that fire, which is an inanimate object, should not be firing itself on the Sabbath, that is certainly not spirit of the law stuff at all, if that was a part of it. So no, I'm not sure if that was oral or actually one of the many in there.
Do sacrifices?
Right, yeah, there were sacrifices, so there had to be some level of fire for that. Yeah, good point. All right, so there's more concern from the Pharisees about their oral law than about the actual intent of the law. There's at least two main situations regarding the Sabbath, which are repeated in all three synoptic gospels. What do we mean by synoptic gospels? Right, they agree with each other in many places, and which three agree with each other the most? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right. So the first three, a lot more similarities. In those three, you don't have all of what John has. In, for instance, the I am statements and the upper room discourse, you don't have nearly as much of that. So John is still a gospel, a very good one, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similarities. So we have two different ones that I'll give you that are repeated almost word for word, a couple little details that are kind of unique to a couple of them, of situations of Sabbath and the Pharisees or others accusing Jesus of breaking it. So two main situations, we'll look at those along with several other occasions of healing and other situations where the Sabbath is mentioned in the Gospels. This isn't every reference to the Sabbath in the Gospels, not necessarily every healing even either, but enough to give us an idea here of what Jesus believed. So first we see that Jesus allowed the disciples to pick grain to eat on the Sabbath. So if you would, turn to Matthew 12, and we'll read verses 1 through 8, and then just so you're aware, Mark 2 and Luke 6 both contain a very similar story. Mark 2 has a verse that was, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which was a one that wasn't in the others and is helpful. And then also in the Matthew passage, we have the reference in verse 7 back to text in Hosea, saying that to obey or mercy is better than sacrifice. And that kind of repeats a theme in other parts of Scripture where people aren't focused on the heart like they should be. And then in Matthew 12, verse 8, you also have the Son of Man as Lord, even of the Sabbath day, which is an important theme throughout as he's showing he came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. But he's Lord of the Sabbath. He's the one who actually rules and reigns over it. And he is able to do what he desires on this day. So Jesus allows the disciples to pick grain to eat on the Sabbath. And I learned something new this week, my cultural experience on the other side of the pond. So King James uses corn many times in speaking actually of wheat, and that's actually a British thing. And they call what we call corn, they call that maize, which is the Spanish word for corn is maíz. So there you go. That's why it will sometimes say corn in there when it's really referring actually to what we would call wheat. So now you know whether you wanted to or not. But that is what I learned at an old corn mill in Wales. All right, so let's read here Matthew chapter 12. If someone could read verses 1 through 4 and someone else verses 5 through 8. We'll take the first 4. Well, and then verses 5 through 8. Christina, go ahead.
At the time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was hungered, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests.
For have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Right, thank you. So they look back, Jesus looks back and mentions David, how when he was hungry on the Sabbath and they ate bread that they weren't even supposed to have when he was on the run there, I believe, from Saul. But I want to point out that before each of these texts and these synoptic references behind me, look at what's at the end of chapter 11, a well-known passage. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Just kind of interesting, right before this passage where Jesus is saying he's Lord of the Sabbath, they're allowed to do these things, they're allowed to be fed on the Sabbath. Right before that, a reminder of his care and of his lowliness, that people can come to him and he gives rest. The rest is found in him, the Lord of the Sabbath, not just in their Pharisaical set of rules. And then in Mark 2 and Luke 6, or end of Luke 5, Both of those, the passages preceding, are the reference of the old and the new wineskins, that you don't put new wine in old wineskins. So even there's right before those texts, there's a reference to what is old and what is new, that the old is passing away. So I think that's just a unique aspect of where each of these texts actually fall. But what's going on here? Jesus is going about on his mission with the disciples, and they would walk quite clearly on the Sabbath to the next place to do ministry, as we'll notice later. And similar to how Paul in the book of Acts, where does he go on the Sabbath day, even as a Christian? To the synagogue to teach the gospel, because that's the place where they were teaching at that time still in the Old Testament law. But he would go and minister to the Jews at the synagogue on the Sabbath. Jesus was still ministering and still doing different things on the Sabbath, which required walking to and fro between different places. And so as they're going, and they went through the corn, perhaps a field that, I don't know if it had been harvested, and so they were just gleaning it or what, or whether they were actually taking from what was just already there and unharvested, we aren't told. But it was okay, whatever it was that they did. The disciples were hungry, and they plucked ears of corn and to eat them. And so I know, based on now my new cultural experience, that wasn't corn on the cob that they were eating. So sorry to disappoint you about that. But that was ears of wheat that they're taking and nibbling off of to give themselves some sustenance along the way. So this wasn't a matter of farm work that had been neglected. This wasn't, a farmer actually who had put it off and said, I'll just do it on Sabbath day. That would have been a whole other story, even for Jesus, because that would have been clearly breaking of the law. But Jesus is showing that mission work is what is most important. And that meant that his disciples getting a little bit of grab and go, a little bit of takeout food when they were hungry on the Sabbath, that was okay. And that's because Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Mark 2:27, in that parallel passage there at the end, it says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What does that mean? That the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What do you think?
For man, and if we make it work, then that's not rest.
Okay. It's rest for man, and if you make it work, then it's naturally not rest. There was a purpose for it. It wasn't just for the tradition itself. Man didn't need to serve the Sabbath itself. God gave the Sabbath to man in the Old Testament for his own purposes of their resting. What else? Anything? All right, and then Matthew 12:7 makes a similar point. Jesus quotes there from Hosea 6:6, saying, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That phrase is used elsewhere for example, Saul in 1 Samuel, where he's bringing a sacrifice to God, and God says, I desire actual, genuine obedience, not just this empty, ritualistic sacrifice that you think you are using to gain my favor. And so he says, in quoting from Hosea 6, and also in that context, of course, it's Israel being the unfaithful wife to Hosea, in that picture as he takes Gomer as his wife. God doesn't desire empty, ritualistic traditionalism. God desires true devotion that isn't forced or fabricated. And so here, Jesus says that the Pharisees don't even know what that phrase means. If you knew what it means, he says in verse 7, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless. You wouldn't hold people to these higher standards that aren't even given truly by God. So the book that Pastor Billy and I have used in creating some of this study says this: the Sabbath with its legislation was never meant to be a tyrant that enslaved people by its insufferable demands, but a benefit and privilege instituted for the sake of people and their enjoyment. Sabbath wasn't made for man, or the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It wasn't just meant to be something that was a chore, because once again, that kind of defeats the purpose. It wasn't to be about work. It's a benefit, it's a privilege given by God for people in their enjoyment. And then next we see that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, which is probably what you think of most about Jesus and the Sabbath in the Gospels, because there's many references to his healing different people on the Sabbath, some that I probably don't even have. But you have these parallels from Matthew 12, Mark 3, and Luke 6, which are all right after the occasion of picking food from the fields on the Sabbath. One of them does, though, actually say another Sabbath or the next Sabbath or something like that, but they're all following in the text and all on the Sabbath regardless. So let's read, since most of you hopefully are still in Matthew 12, let's read this account as well. Matthew 12, so someone read verses 9 through 11, and then someone else verses 12 through 14. Octavia, 9 through 11, and he'll do 12 through 14.
Will the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the husbandman, and will give the vineyard unto others. And have not...
Hang on, I think you're in the wrong place. Matthew 12, 9.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Started 9, right?
I did, didn't I?
12, 9.
No. Mark?
Matthew.
Long book.
Get the right
right
book.
chapter.
Yeah. Sorry. Chapter 12. Verse 9. I'm there now, I think. And when he was departed thence, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? And how much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Oh, then he said to the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him.
All right. So, they are on the Sabbath still. There's a man with a hand withered, and they want it. Notice, what is the purpose of them asking Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? What are the Pharisees doing?
Trying to trick him.
Yeah.
They're living under the old covenant.
Right, which Jesus is too, though. That's the trouble with this, right?
But he's training us, I think, it looks like he's training us for the new covenant. Just as Moses did at the end of Deuteronomy. He's teaching the new covenant to the people that cross the river, the Jordan.
So yeah, it is transitional in nature, and also they didn't have someone like Jesus who could just heal as easily in the Old Testament. Obviously, there's some references of healing and all that, but he's showing them what is actually better, because they are trying to accuse him. They are trying to get him to do what they think is unlawful, which may not even be from the Old Testament law at all, maybe just completely from their oral tradition anyways, and trying to get him to have something that they can accuse him over. And you see at the end in verse 14 that they held a council how to destroy him. That's their motivation, right? Is it really about theology, or is it actually about their position, right? That's really what it comes down to. Is it about how Jesus was pushing the boundaries of what they wanted, about how Jesus was taking away the attention that they wanted? And so this man has a withered hand, and Jesus responds to them when they ask, is it lawful? And he said, what man is there that has one sheep? And you think of the other passage about the 99 sheep and the one, and the shepherd does what? Says, I got a 99% on my test. That's an A. That's really good. I'm happy. No. He says, out of love for that one other, stupider, sheep, he'll go out and leave the 99 to save the one. And so here it says, what man is there who has one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath day? Will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? And there were actually provisions in the law, I don't know if you looked at any of them last week, that referenced things that could be done on the Sabbath. There's references of pulling out a big animal that's stuck in a pit and all that. And so he's like, that's okay to care for an animal who is stuck, who needs help on the Sabbath. How much is a man better than a sheep? What are they doing here? Their attention is so focused on the letter of the law that they don't even care about people. And what's new? That's the Pharisees in a nutshell, because it's all about them. But Jesus is saying, this man here has a withered hand. No doubt it's been for quite some time. But Jesus encountered him on a Saturday. So is he really going to wait till the next day to do good to this man? Is this really even work, obviously, in the first place, when Jesus can just, there, snapped his finger. Well, maybe he didn't even have to do that. No, of course he didn't. But how is this even work to do this? This is what it is to do good. And so he says it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath days, and then he tells the man, stretch it out, and he does, and his hand is healed like the other. And then similar accounts there in Mark and Luke. But let's move on here. 3 other healings that I've put for us. So if someone could turn to Luke 10, 2 people in Luke 13, I can read as well. Luke 13, someone read verses 10 through 13. Bethany. And then Luke 13, 14 through 17. So splitting that first one up into 2. So who will read Luke 13, 14 through 17? Jason, so pick up after Bethany. All right, go ahead, Bethany.
Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had had a disabling spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, Woman, you are freed from your disability. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God.
But the synagogue official, indignant, became because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, there are 6 days in which work should be done. So come during them and get healed, but not on the Sabbath day. But the Lord answered him and said, You hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan had bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day? And as he said this, all his opponents were being humiliated, and the entire crowd was rejoicing over the glorious things being done by him.
All right. So you see a similar story here. In this case, though, it specifies that this woman has been suffering for 18 years. Couldn't even stand up straight. I'm not sure, what this could have been. Maybe a back issue, extreme scoliosis. Who knows, right? Doesn't even matter. But she's been suffering, and Jesus just says, "You're free. You are healed." And they, of course, even though she glorifies God, they respond with indignation. They're mad. They're upset about this. And they say there's 6 days in which men ought to work, and on the 7th they are to rest. So she should come on the other days, right? And that sounds like some references in the Old Testament. in the sense that it does say, 6 days you'll labor and do all your work, and on the seventh, you will not. Of course, you also have from creation, Jesus or God resting on the seventh day, which isn't ever given as a command, but is given as a principle, I believe, of rest, in that God rested from his labor. But here, once again, they are contorting, they're twisting together what is actually good and right to do with what they have in their law as well as in their oral law. And so Jesus responds again. He calls them out as hypocrites. If your donkey is in the stall, will you not take him out to water him? Like, there were still certain things that may have needed to be done on the Sabbath. And so, once again, argument from the lesser to the greater. What about this woman? Should she not be considered of much greater importance that she could be healed from her struggles on this day? We really tell her, oh, sorry, doctor's office is closed. Come back at 9 tomorrow morning. Sorry about that. When he can just do it and be healed. And we see a greater response here that his adversaries were ashamed in verse 17, and all the people rejoiced at these great things that were done. And so God is glorified in the end in that. And then Luke 14, verses 1 through 6. Someone could read that for us. Luke 14, 1 through 6. Joe?
One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on the Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things.
All right, so once again, they are left without an answer. Kind of counts very close to each other, no doubt, chronologically, of Jesus saying what is better to do, which is more important. The letter of the law, which doesn't even forbid someone like Jesus from actually healing, but just the issue that they had with what Jesus was doing. And really, I think it all, in this case, came a lot back to their just simple jealousy of the attention which Jesus received, of the power which he had. And so he lets them know what is what. He gives the example again. If you have an animal stuck in a pit, would you not pull him out? And they have no answer. And then turn over to John chapter 5, a lengthier text, so I'll summarize a little bit here. But this is the healing at the pool of Bethesda, which is where people could go and actually be healed. And that an angel went down at a certain season in the pool, verse 4, and the first one in would be healed. And so people would be standing or sitting, waiting there, trying to get into the pool to be the first to be healed of their issue. And Jesus goes and heals this man which had had an infirmity for 38 years. And he tells him in verse 8, "Rise, take up your bed, and walk." And immediately, he's made whole, he takes up his bed, he walks, and that same day was the Sabbath. And so then, you have, once again, another issue that the Jews take with what has been done. So just to summarize, verse 10, they say it's the Sabbath, it's not lawful, but Jesus had told them, take up your bed. And then it says that the one who was healed didn't know who it was that had told him this. In verse 14, it says, "Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. Therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. But Jesus answered them, My Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So of course they're accusing him of false identity with God. But notice he says, My Father works and I work. He's saying he's equal with God, but what's he saying? God works in this sense to do good on the Sabbath. It is good to do good on the Sabbath. And really ultimately, in verse 14, where he says, and it's similar to other passages where Jesus says your sins are forgiven, right? And the leaders don't like that. How does Jesus have the power to forgive sins? And he says, which is easier, to tell the man your sins are forgiven, or to tell the man to get up and walk? And this points us to what's ultimately going on here. Jesus isn't just on a healing mission. He's not just making people better physically. He's also concerned for them spiritually. And so he says that this man is made whole and tells him to sin no more. He's speaking to his spiritual condition as well. And then we have some other occurrences as well. Any questions, though, before we go on? All right, so in Luke 4:16, it was Jesus' custom to go to the Sabbath, or to go to the synagogue for public reading on the Sabbath. And as a Jew, Jesus was still keeping the Sabbath that was in the law, just not in the way that the Pharisees did. But we do see a precedent here of he is going, he's opening the Word and reading for them on the Sabbath. Incidentally, he's reading about himself from the book of Isaiah, and it's speaking of his healing, really both physically and spiritually. And so he's reading about this on the Sabbath. And so there is a precedent that continues on that Jesus is following what was at the time the true Old Testament law, which was given only to Jews. But he was a Jew, and he's following in that. And you see that followed as well, like we said, among the apostles later on. But this shows us, I think, that Jesus wasn't throwing it all away. He was, once again, in this kind of transitional period before the church is instituted and the church begins to worship on Sunday. He is still following this law, and yet he realizes what is actually more important in that. Is it the letter of the law, the strict adherence? If there was even a passage in the Old Testament that said exactly, you must not do that. No, he's saying that to make these people well is of greatest importance. That is what is important to him. And then look at John chapter 7. Just a brief little occurrence regarding the Sabbath. He says this in John 7, verse 22. Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath day receive circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are ye angry at me because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. So they're, once again, upset by someone being made whole on the Sabbath, and he brings up circumcision, kind of a favorite later on of people that were testing whether or not one was a true believer. And there's, of course, the fight of sorts and controversy in the early church when they were trying to figure out whether someone needed to be circumcised in order to be saved. And obviously the Pharisees were very much on the doing of good works and being circumcised the 8th day. And so what is he saying here? Moses gave circumcision, and on the Sabbath you circumcise. When was circumcision to take place? On the 8th day. And so, assuming that they structured the the 8th day the same way we would. That means that every single baby boy born on a Friday was going to get circumcised on the Sabbath. And so Jesus is saying, now you're elevating that you can do that work on the Sabbath day because, well, that's following God's commands. You must do that on the Sabbath day, but you will not do good on the Sabbath day. You are circumcising, cutting, hurting on the Sabbath day, but yet you're angry at me because I've made a man whole on the Sabbath day. Which is greater? Which is of more significance? He would heal a man on the Sabbath, and they would take issue with that. So the Pharisees, if you haven't gotten the drift yet, certainly did not view Jesus as keeping the Sabbath. They questioned so many of his healings. There's another one in John chapter 9, which is the one where Jesus takes the clay and puts it on the man's eyes and heals him on the Sabbath. And the Jews accuse him of not being of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. And yet they wonder how someone, if he was such a sinner, could do such miracles. They can't comprehend who he truly is. And so the Sabbath instances that we see in the Gospels are mostly all in the context of Jesus versus the Pharisees. It was still before the church was formed, still about Jews under the Mosaic law, but throughout it all, Jesus shows them that their hearts and their focus are completely wrong. The Jews' oral law had become so man-centered that it didn't even allow the saving of life on the Sabbath. Of course, it should be lawful to do good and to save life on the Sabbath. Jesus has asked him that in these texts. Is it not good to do this? It's a rhetorical question. Of course it's good to still do good on the Sabbath. Jesus' mission was of greater importance, though, than their cultural current understanding of what the Sabbath ought to be, which was based on nothing but oral tradition. He couldn't just simply put off his missional ministry until the next day. He was there to do good now. I have a lengthy quote here that's in 3 different slides on the screen. It says this: Jesus' paramount concern was to be about his mission, whether or not the Sabbath was involved. But in his zeal to accomplish God's will, he cannot be accused of provoking the conflicts over the Sabbath. Nor is there any suggestion in the accounts that he was less than careful to observe the actual requirements of the Torah in respect to the Sabbath. Once again, he's following the law. He is God. He knows what the law is, and he knows the heart of the law, where if there's ever anything that isn't exactly spelled out, he still knows what to follow. He is focused in the right place. As has been noted, the Mosaic Sabbath, with its requirement of cessation from work, was not designed to achieve total inactivity so much as total abstention from one's regular daily work. When this is remembered, it is hard to see how, for instance, the disciples' plucking of the ears of corn and eating them can be considered as a profanation of the Mosaic Sabbath. It's not about total inactivity in as much as it is about abstaining, about keeping from one's regular work and schedule. And this, I think, is more of what the principle of the Sabbath means for today, one in which we're getting to in the next couple weeks. But we aren't Jews. We aren't under the law. We never were. We never will be. But what was the principle of it all? It was about drawing near to God by pausing regularly to rest and to worship. He concludes there, if they had been farm workers or even women making up for lack of preparation for a meal, it would have been a different matter. But their casual plucking of corn on a walk scarcely falls into any such categories. Similarly, the healings Jesus performs on the Sabbath are scarcely candidates for the descriptions of profanations of the Sabbath, or however you say that, profanations, I don't know. But what Jesus did on the Sabbath wasn't described in the Old Testament as being something that was against the law. And so Jesus wasn't breaking it, but he's most importantly concerned about doing what is good and beneficial for them. So in conclusion, these texts point us to what it means that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He wasn't to be restrained by human tradition, which would actually prevent him from doing good. That wasn't the point. As Lord of the Sabbath, he actually knew what was most important, right? As Lord of the Sabbath, he knew who needed help. He knew what he could do to help them. And so Jesus' interactions with the Sabbath point us to what is most important about it. It all comes back to bringing honor to God with our lives and living to fulfill his purposes for us. That is the principle that we see in the Sabbath, even as they're still keeping it in the gospel era. We often frame Sabbath or the Lord's Day about being for rest or for worship, and these are correct. But what we see in the Gospels is that what is most important is doing the will of the Master. And so Jesus showed time and time again that his missional ministry would not just fit into some cookie-cutter framework of what people expected. He was concerned about the heart. He was concerned about doing good and fulfilling what people actually needed in that time. And so it helps us to set up our next time together in the early church and the epistles, as they are no longer under the law. And we see this transition of now Christians worshiping on the Lord's Day, on Sunday, which was not Saturday at all. It was the first of the week. And many of them were still working and doing their jobs, which is why Eutychus probably in the sermon, was that last week? I think so. I wasn't sleeping, but how Eutychus fell asleep, right? Because he's been working. There's a different era, and yet these ongoing principles of what God actually requires of us. And so we'll see in that transition, a big transition from especially what you saw last week in the Old Testament, because now the Lord's Day is when Christians of both Jew and Gentile background worship, but the goal and the purpose and how that looks is completely different from what it was in the Old Testament era. So we'll pick up there next week in Acts and the epistles and several different references that we find there. Any questions before we close? Yes?
The word Sabbath, does that actually mean like seventh day, or does it mean, what does it mean? The word Sabbath.
Good question. I'm not sure the actual etymology of it.
Isn't the word Sabbath also used for some other festival days or some kind of days in the Old Testament that they, like years?
Right, well, there's
year,
a Sabbath year.
Seventh
Yeah,
year.
the seventh year. Yeah.
And that sort of thing. So that Sabbath is a different thing from the Sabbath of the week.
Yeah, it's seventh in that sense, to
I
the
don't
seventh
know.
year, but
You know, like Sabbath it's used like that as opposed to like, you know, baptism is used because there was no word
Oh, right.
for that.
Yeah.
And they use the word Sabbath, or is it something different?
no.
Well, of course, it is, when last week we said that the Sabbath was never brought forward into the New Testament, that particular. But is it, when Paul wrote, we are crucified with Christ and we're baptized into Christ, every day is a day of rest with Christ. Sunday is a reproof of what we believe. We come to reproof our belief. We're here to show, just like baptism, to show our faith. We come here to show God our faith and to learn more, to make sure that we're correct with what we believe. And of course, we lean on you for your knowledge, for that reproof of what we believe.
Yeah, well, I think we'll look at that some next week because Hebrews talks about Jesus as a Sabbath rest. And so it's kind of, that's the transition. There is a Sabbath, it's called Jesus. And we don't just rest on him 24 hours out of 168. So I think there's principles of rest that we'll look at, but not any strict rule and regulation like they had there. So, and yeah, I'll try to look into, like, what is the actual root of that word? So I'm not sure. I have to talk to the Hebrew scholar, too, when he gets back. All right, anything else? All right, let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the rest that we can find in you. We thank you for these texts and how Jesus shows what the true point was and how he's focused most of all on people's hearts and their souls and his concern over them and about doing good. And we just pray as we continue in this study that you'd give us greater understanding and clarity of your word and what it says about this. So we thank you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.